Okay, so greetings to all from New Delhi, India, and thanks to Professor Jurgen, Dr. Ankit, Dr. Rupam for giving me this opportunity to share some of my views and, in fact, experiences while working with Indian Western Himalayas. So the title of a talk today will be Indian Western Himalaya, a climate change world. And when we actually look at the kind of activities we are doing in India, especially in my laboratory, we call it Spatial Analysis and Informatics Laboratory. We heavily depend on remote sensing, satellite remote sensing data processing, spatial data analysis using GIS science, and spatial modeling, which is supported by intensive and extensive field excursions. Primarily, we focus on forest ecosystems while mapping, characterizing, including biomass, road ecology, fire ecology, and also trying to understand how climate change is impacting these ecosystems. Gradually, we have moved to agriculture ecosystems, understanding close linkage between forest and agriculture, specifically in mountain systems. And in Western Himalayas, we tried understanding some of the socio-ecological systems while understanding and interacting with farmer community over there. Another challenge which is being seen nowadays is the rate of urbanization, which is taking place in these mountain areas. It is along with expansion of road and also demand for higher and better residences when population is increasing. And more than that, the aspiration of people residing over there is increasing. So here again, we try to link it to urban heat islands, ecosystem health, including vulnerability assessment and ecosystem services. A part of research is also around mapping, especially monitoring snow cover or glacier lake mapping. Today, specifically, I will be touching only upon forest and agriculture ecosystems of these mountainous areas. I will briefly touch upon background and the kind of things which generally motivate us or trigger us to look into forest areas, and the ways we have tried understanding forest cover dynamics and the relationship or linkage with the climate change phenomena. As I said, forest feeds agriculture in the mountain ecosystems. There are well-established field-based accounting which have communicated that to have a sustainable agriculture system over there, the dependency on forest is very high. And probably if forest remains intact, they will be a natural feeder to agriculture fields. But we wish to look at agriculture communities over here. So we'll be looking at the frameworks which we have tried testing upon for vulnerability assessment or farmer topology. Finally, I will end with some of the learnings or the outcomes which we could gather from our studies and the way probably we'll be moving ahead. Before actually going into that, just for the interest of the audience, when we look at Himalayas, probably this is the highest continuous geographical feature which is over the Earth planet. And the beauty is whether you look at from your west to east arc or moving from south to north, we get to see a gradient, and within a very small distance, there is a huge amount of altitudinal gradient. Unlike many of the mountain ecosystems of the world, this is the one which is which is having a very high population density. So with presence of human beings, with gradients, altitudinal gradients, ecological gradients, and the diversity which exists over there, this makes this as a ready-made laboratory to investigate many of the research questions which might have global implications. Beyond that, there is a very high degree of endemicity, which brings it as a very important biodiversity hotspot when you are looking at the global map of biological distribution. Our perspective was always remained while looking at how communities, human communities, interact with the resources which are around over there, and subsequently looking into the indicators of climate change and their subsequent impact on either forest ecosystems or agriculture communities. So we all know Himalaya nowadays are being discussed a lot. This is said to be as a third pole of the Earth because of highest presence of snow cover apart from the two poles. Apart from this, if you look at, this supports huge amount of humanity not only in the downstream within mountains, but across mountain ecosystems beyond the transboundary layers. It is definitely an ecological buffer, which also plays a significant role in terms of meteorology when it comes to monsoons in the country. But at the same time, it is very fragile, sensitive to climate change, and there is a persistent poverty, which is often talked about. To us, when we look at from the scientific investigation, its remoteness and isolation in multiple perspectives makes it much more interesting. The limited livelihood options makes it much more challenging to understand. And at the same time, being the youngest mountain ecosystem, it is still in its teenage turmoil, which brings a huge amount of natural disasters, including climate change induced disasters, which are being talked about. So therein we see a mosaic which brings a huge amount of conflict when natural resource management is talked about in these mountain ecosystems. One of the most debatable points, which is there in Indian Himalaya particularly, is talking about hydropower dams. There are all different scales of dams which have been talked about. Chiri Dam, one of the globally known dam, which is probably one of the largest in these mountain areas, had actually taken 5 decades to see the light of the day. Likewise, there are many of the other development activities, including expansion of roads and aligned infrastructure, which has always brought into a debatable context in Himalayas as the topmost priority. Over the period, what we have observed is the population is increasing like any other part of the country. It is exponentially growing. And in all mountain ecosystems, you get to see not only a higher population density, which could be one of the criteria to define urbanization, but also the urban fabric, which is changing over there. And this is very peculiar when you are looking at the Western Indian Himalayan region. You talk about Uttarakhand, you talk about Jammu Kashmir, or even Himachal Pradesh. We have witnessed the kind of population increase which is there. It has actually intensified the urban fabric. So, which is one of a very interesting point to look at from the perspective of sustainable development in mountains. But we are probably more inclined towards looking at climate change and its interaction with various resources. And if you refer to the recent AR6, which has come in the first week of August, it again re-emphasizes on the evidences which have come in light of changes in precipitation patterns and also increase in temperature. So we have significantly high temperature regimes when you compare it with last few decades. And though in a numeric form, they might be appearing very small, but when you look at from the perspective of impacts on all kind of life forms, these are something very sensitive. In precipitation pattern, we have seen very erratic kind of rainfalls, and many a times downpour is in one point of time. And people also attribute, cloudburst kind of events over there. And even in recent past, there were some of the episodic events which were could be qualified as climate change induced disasters in the mountain ecosystems. So given this background, and this area becomes somewhat very interesting to look at from the scientific investigation point of view, from the point of view of better understanding of ecosystem and, the way entire world is looking at sustainable development goals, and also policy intervention at the national level, which need to be done. So here, what we basically understand that the resource, whether these are glaciers, these are agriculture system, or the known forest cover, which is over there, it has its own way of, changing. There could be some kind of physiological changes or even behavioral changes, which could be seen from individual vis-a-vis to these ecosystems. And these bring spatio-temporal variations over the landscape. It could be in terms of diurnal changes, seasonal variations which are taking place, or some of the areas which are becoming hotspots of forest fragmentation or loss of biodiversity. Likewise, intensification of agriculture or intensification of urban fabric, which is taking place in these areas. So it is basically a cumulative impact which is there on the resources. From the one end, there is a huge anthropogenic pressure, and from the other end, climate change is, bringing in different kind of challenges onto these kind of resources. So that makes it, a double impact of two very contrasting actors, which can play a very significant role while bringing any kind of intervention from the policy perspective. So our much broader aim is to understand the local communities. One is forest and another is the agriculture communities in light of climate change. And today, particularly, I'm trying to dwell on these two aspects. So as I said, one of the primary research agenda is always exploiting or exploring to the potential of remote sensing inputs. So unlike one-time data, we had always pronounced on looking at the seasonal data, even for the preparation of land use land cover maps. Like two distinct dates which exist in these mountains are pre-monsoon and the post-monsoon, wherein significant variation could be seen in terms of land use land cover change. Apart from the changes in land use land cover, elevation or gradient in elevation along with slope and aspect, that plays a very significant role in terms of defining what is where and what kind of land use activities could be carried out. So to significantly utilize them, we are using some of the spectral indices as input for our land use land cover mapping, wherein some kind of multivariate and data analysis is generally carried out. While doing this kind of stuff, we always look at if data set could be generated at 2 or 3 different levels of classification. So basically, we are attempting to map it for time 1. When I say time 1 means season 1 of time 1, and then time 2, season 2 of time 1. And then using some knowledge-based or information-based data fusion, we try to dig out what is the actual land use or land cover pattern there onto the landscape. And having 2 different or 3 different level of classification basically helps us to understand how the transition between various land use land cover classes are taking place. So this was one of our experimental exercises which we tried attempting in Northeast India initially, and then subsequently did it in the Western Himalayas also. And what we understand from here is, if you are looking only at one-time satellite data, probably you are underestimating certain things. And that one of the typical land use over there is the agriculture fields, which is something very seasonal, though it is a rain-fed landscape, but still we see a huge variation with respect to season when agriculture is to be accounted. And there are chances of overestimation of other resource forest, which is there if you are specifically going to post-monsoon satellite data. So one needs an integrated approach, looking at the seasonal variation and then putting them on to top of each other with a decision-making tool, so that integrated one-time land use land cover map could be developed. And as I said, this is more of a hierarchical classification, which helps you to fuse classes within, because looking at different type of initiatives which are being taking place, at one end, we are talking about biodiversity conservation. On the other end, we are talking about RED or CDM kind of activities. So they demand different level of classification. So using such type of hierarchical approach often helps us to produce or to develop a database which could be used by multiple actors. So using same methodology and same set of training sets for as an input for image classification, we are able to generate temporal land use land cover maps, and they are always tested using some of the testing data for the level of accuracy which is over there. For a common instance of temporal forest cover or land use land cover mapping, probably achieving accuracy is close 90 plus is something very common. But when you are looking at such a rugged terrain, wherein with a slight variation in aerial distance, huge variety comes within onto the ground, and where orography plays very significant role in terms of the kind of vegetation which is there. So achieving even close to 90% accuracy is something very good from the scientific perspective. And when you are looking at from the user's accuracy or producer's accuracy, we get to see that many of the target classes which are of interest, they are having a fairly good accuracy. Now, when we get these kind of temporal data set, one of the ways of looking at this temporal data set is the kind of changes which have taken place. And our understanding says that forest is degrading, but the rate of change in forest degradation is slowing down. And it has actually slowed down in many of the parts of Himalayas. One of the very fundamental reason is the Forest Conservation Act, which is much more stringent on ground today. Second thing is less dependency of people on forest resources for their fuel wood need, specifically fuel wood need. When cleaner and relatively cheaper energy sources are being provided to communities, we are able to see that the variation in forest degradation has actually reduced in these areas. But we wish to further quantify that with a much more objective metrics, which is called as forest fragmentation, which looks at the temporal variation as well as the spatial variation in terms of entities of land use, land cover. When you are looking at in a spatial domain, probably you are looking at the patch, its edge, the degree of proliferation which is taking place over there, and what way zones are being talked about. But at the same time, when you are looking at a temporal domain, probably one is able to identify some of the locations where anthropogenic fragmentation is more prominent rather than natural fragmentation, which is by virtue of invasive species. So Lantana camara, Eupitorium are two of the notorious species which we have accounted on these landscapes while doing our fieldwork, which were in literature generally being talked up to 1,000 meter altitude. In our fieldworks, we had seen that these have gone up to 1,800 to 2,000 meter altitude. And our much recent study tells us that it has gone up to 2,400 meter altitude. So that also plays a very significant role. Another phenomena which is taking place in these mountain ecosystems is, agriculture land is being abandoned. People are going to downstream to cities in the plain areas for their livelihoods and all, and the family members which are left behind, they don't have much of the mechanism, including manpower, to cultivate things on the land. So this results into growth of some, all odd kind of vegetation over there, which from a satellite data looks as if it is greening of the landscape. But probably that is not true. Another important thing is natural and anthropogenic fragmentation, which might appear almost similar in pattern and distribution in the area, but our quantification tells us that in the valley locations or in the relatively flat locations, the anthropogenic fragmentation is much higher. Whereas when you are looking at higher ridges, so therein natural forest fragmentation is much more acute. So that tells us there is human pressure, which is playing a significant role over there. But apart from human pressure, there is some kind of ecological activities which are taking place, which might be bringing altogether different type of mosaics onto the landscapes, and which is resulting into forest fragmentation. As I said, though deforestation or forest degradation is still taking place, there are wonderful attempts like Campa funds, which are ensuring either artificial or enhancing natural reforestation activities can take place onto the ground. So we get to see a mixed kind of response, but more of a forest degradation, which is still taking place. So when we looked at a contrasting distribution of forest fragmentation, anthropogenic in the valleys or in the relatively plain areas or gentle slope areas, whereas natural fragmentation in the higher ridges, we thought, let us look at how species distribution is taking place in these areas using some of the strengths of ecological niche modeling. While doing that, we identified climate layers or the indicators of climate change as one of the driving factors which can actually communicate the ecological come environmental envelopes which are conducive for growth or a retreat of a particular type of vegetation. So we relied on IPCC fifth assessment report and the RCPs which were recommended by them. And while doing this, we got a very interesting result. And we, while doing this exercise, we typically focused on some of the key three species which are there. Three are the oak species, generally called as Banj, Kharsu, and Moru. They have their ecological, expansions and also dependency on shade and moisture and sunlit conditions. Pine is the another one, which is ecology called as a very hardy species, one of a very notorious one, which can grow anywhere. So our ecological niche modeling results tell us that Banj is the one which is, which is changing its ecological landscapes. It is going to higher ridges. So broadly, there is a range shift, and which is significantly very important to look at. Another thing is pine. As I said, it is one of a notorious and hardy species. So it is again able to take the full opportunity or full benefit of rise in temperature in some of the areas. So it is again going to the higher ridges. Whereas the other Kharsu and Moru oak, therein we couldn't see a very clear-cut or statistically significant pattern, but we got to understand that Kharsu, which is probably more moisture-favoring one, it is coming towards to the down landscapes. When we try looking at the key factors which might be playing very significant role using the local sensitivity analysis, one thing was very common for all the species, which is known to any of the ecologists of the world, is the elevation, which plays significant role in mountain areas. But apart from that, when you look at each of the species, the annual range of the temperature, the precipitation in the coldest quarter is significantly affecting Moru, whereas temperature seasonality or temperature annual temperature annual range, those are basically affecting pine, Banj oak, or Kharsu oak respectively. So that kind of specific response to variation in precipitation and temperature regimes could be seen with these key species. And just for the benefit of non-ecologists, tree is one of a very good indicator. But if we are more interested to see on the impact of these things, probably the lower life forms, especially herbs, are the ones which need to be accounted, and we are taking some of the steps to do that. But one of a very wonderful, comparative account which we could get to see is there is a separate set of ecologists working at Space Application Center, Ahmedabad. They relied typically on satellite data, unlike our efforts of ecological modeling. And using the data sets for last 4 or 5 decades, they actually mapped, while carrying out ground truth, the timberline. So this is the actual visual interpretation of the timberline, taking help from the ground realities. And what you get to see across Himalayas, so though the magnitude varies, but across Himalayas, there are significant indicators that timberline is actually shifting. And if you try quantifying this, probably in the last 4 decades, there is an order of 300 plus meters, this kind of shift has been seen. So it means, one, on the ground, the kind of things which are happening, and with a window of 4 to 5 decades, and the another prospective modeling, which we have tried accounting and seen that by 2070s or 80s, there will be a significant range shift of many of the forest species. And just to further share the importance of these species, oak is probably the most preferred species for fodder and in special cases for timber. Apart from that, it provides huge amount of ecosystem services, whether it is groundwater recharge, whether it is increase in amount of nitrogen in the soil. Whereas pine has many of the commercial uses extraction of resin, and also using it as one of the timber species in the mountains. In addition to this, if you look at this socio-ecological system, quite a good amount of services come from forest areas, and they all feed to the agriculture communities. So we thought, looking at some of the aspects of agriculture fields or agriculture communities as well, to see the linkages, if there are some kind of linkages between our forest ecosystems and agriculture ecosystems when dynamism is being talked about. Unfortunately, the landscape has very small land holdings in terms of agriculture fields across the mountains. There are few of the valley districts wherein you get to see fairly good amount of agriculture land. But overall, if you see an average, it goes up to 3 hectares of land, and there is huge skewed population which has close to 1 hectares of land. So large land holdings are somewhat very exceptional when we are talking in these mountains. So one of a very indicator based or evidence based study which we could do as a team while moving in different altitudinal zones or different transects of these mountains, that climate change and agriculture has a very direct causal relationship, whether you talk in terms of decrease in rainfall or even erratic rainfalls. Somewhere it affects the not only agriculture land, but also agriculture practices. Same way, when you are looking at the variation in summer temperature, that has again affected many of the inputs which to the agriculture fields. Likewise, in some of the parts, we also witness that variation in snowfall is ultimately affecting the agriculture livelihood. So basically, this causal route motivated us to move from agriculture, forest landscapes onto the agriculture landscapes. So one of the first thing which we thought of doing is just looking at the degree of vulnerability while accounting or developing a framework for that. We just looked at the way IPCC was or is being reporting vulnerability. So what we saw that there is a very specific reference of climate change, climate variability, and climate extreme, which is missing. So it was more of an indicative which helped us to develop or to conceptualize something called as inherent vulnerability. And to our best of knowledge, we saw very limited kind of understanding in this aspect, or people had used this more in a theoretical form. So we tried looking at how vulnerability is being monitored or measured or being communicated in the mountains. So there was a very scanty picture, though there was quite a good rise in publication since 2012 onwards. But still, if you actually try quantifying how and in which locations people are actually doing vulnerability assessment. So again, with this kind of scanty picture, we got to understand people work at different scales. Either a group is working on a very local scale or the regional scale, and there are a bunch of people trying to do at subnational level. So we tried developing a framework which we are able to start from the subnational level. Typically, we call it at district level, and we can further zoom down to village level based on the availability of the data which is being collected by Census of India or NSSO. And now what we have further moved into is we have tried getting up to household level, wherein questionnaires are administered to collect such kind of data set. But while doing it, knowing the inherent characteristic of Himalaya, we very purposefully, we looked at two of the distinct attributes. One is the biophysical attribute and another is a socioeconomic or social attribute of that. So vulnerability is generally defined as function of sensitivity, adaptive capacity, and the exposure. But our framework was more looking at the inherent vulnerability, wherein we were trying to communicate what is the state of affairs. So we relied more on sensitivity and adaptive capacity, but while doing this, we disintegrated them in terms of biophysical and social, both for adaptive capacity and sensitivity. So we use the multi-level approach and typically an hierarchical approach, which takes the support of AHP as a decision-making tool, wherein one can collect the indicators, develop some dimensions and components so that inherent vulnerability could be quantified. And at each of the level, it provides you a wonderful mechanism to carry out a pairwise comparison and to actually weigh each of the indicator or subdimensions to quantify what is probably more important to assess or might be having more importance while assessing inherent vulnerability. So we call them as weights in a typical modeling equation. And while doing this, we had collected data set for 16,000 villages of, in fact, all the villages except only the forest villages of the state of Uttarakhand. So when we tried, developing this kind of understanding, we got to see there is a contrasting picture when you look at the variation or distribution of social vulnerability vis-a-vis biophysical vulnerability, wherein the low zones, the low altitude zones, they have a unique pattern of higher biophysical vulnerability, unlike the social vulnerability. We got to understand that 46% of the tehsils, they lie in the high biophysical vulnerability and also the high social vulnerability component. There are 10% which are lying at the low biophysical and low social vulnerability. So Tehsil is another administrative unit which goes beyond district when you look at the administrative land units or administrative boundaries in the country. So to dig further into that, we had basically integrated social and biophysical vulnerability to see the distribution. And there is a unique pattern that the mid-altitude zones are the locations wherein vulnerability is typically very high. And this could be attributed to two of the inherent factors. One is the population density, which is over there, and the kind of land holdings. But apart from that, if you actually look at the lower zone of the mountains and higher zone of the mountains, the homogeneity in terms of vulnerability is not there, which is something very evident when we are talking about mid-zone villages in the park. So to further substantiate that, we tried looking at a special statistics of the distribution of vulnerability, and it was much more clearer from the hotspot analysis that actually the high vulnerability areas surrounded by high vulnerability are the ones which are concentrated in the mid-zone Himalayas. And our subsequent studies in other parts of the Himalayas further substantiate our argument, which is outcome of this research. So to go substantially into what actually is happening on the ground, we tried to look at farmer typology. To do it, we have taken the 5 capitals of DFID framework, and we got the quantitative data for this based on the administered questionnaire using some sample sizes in each of the representative villages based on the distribution of inherent vulnerability. And then subsequently, we understood that the farmer type is bearing of at least 3 of the broader parameters. One is the personal characteristic of that, which is more being taken care by human capital, financial capital, and to some extent social capital. Another is a household characteristic, which is a intersection of social capital, physical capital, and financial capital. And then there is a farming orientation, which is typically being defined by the natural capital, human capital, and physical capital over there. So while looking at a subset of the data set, and in each of these capitals, which are being substantiated by the variables, we got to understand that there is a huge heterogeneity within a village system or within the cluster of villages when it comes to farmer types. It is very resource endowed kind of characteristic, which is basically talked about. But more than that, it is also the type of farming they are into. two contrasting farming, in fact, three contrasting farming systems, which we got to see over there is, one is a very intensified one. Another is just catching on to the market-oriented cash crop farming, and the other is the subsistence. This all depends on many of the factors. One is very clear-cut landholding. Another is the kind of human wear input or cash input which they are able to put in. The another farmer type which we got to understand over there is, disengaged farmer laborers. This is something very worrisome when we actually look at migration which is taking place and which is often talked about when Central Himalayas is discussed. So there is a very clear-cut, indicator of disengaged farm laborers which are over there. Their number might appear relatively small, but they are bringing a degree of impact. And then dependency on resources, always a denominator to define these kind of things. Just not this, the farmer types are also significantly somewhere setting a narrative for adaptation strategies which are taking place. Broadly, we looked at cropping pattern or the changes in the cropping pattern which have taken place in last few decades there. Same way, the composition or the changes in composition of livestock, land use, soil management, infrastructure, crop insurance, these were always there. But many of these farmers, they are not typically true farmers the way we understand in a given definition. They do have alternative sources of incomes. There are set of farmers who are working in some of the government engagements. There are others who are having some, secondary or tertiary level of revenue generation. And there are very few who are typically the definition of farming. So depending on these kind of exposures, we got to see that there are some set of people, those who have actually stopped growing a given kind of crop. And specifically when it comes to wheat and rice, which are very important. So people have actually stopped planting these, and they have probably shifted on more of a cash crop or some other kind of high yielding varieties of vegetables and even millets and all. Same way, when we are looking at other factors, say for example, crop insurance, we get to see there are limited and probably none who are actually engaged into that. This exercise was carried out prior to announcement of a crop insurance policy in the country, which is now taking shape onto the ground. So I believe some of the ones which were reported that they have limited access to crop insurance might have gone into the newer scheme. But still, there was almost missing kind of evidences when we were looking at these kind of things. And as I said, when you look at alternative income sources, there are daily wage laborers, they have shops, they seasonally migrate, they have non-timber extractions from forest areas, including agriculture fields, and also depending on borrowed money. So these kind of contrasting things were there when we looked at as a short-term and long-term strategy of adaptation. To give it more meaningful, envelope, and especially looking at how policy are being drafted or implemented, we did a very quick assessment of what scientific literature is talking about when it comes to climate change related adaptation and events which are taking place or interventions by the government, and also the policy document. One of a very contrasting thing which had come through this systematic review work, and then looking into the sub details of both scientific literature and policy documents, that in policy documents, it is more talked about agriculture systems, whereas the scientific literature is time and again, embarking on farming communities, that the farming community should be the center of adaptation planning or mitigation to climate change. Whereas probably, the policy documents have missed that very important component, which need to be and which should be included along with agriculture systems per se. Apart from that, the very important points of social issues, accessibility to resources, infrastructure, services, or local specificity. This is almost missing when we are looking at the government documents or the policy documents at the behest of both state and the federal government. Whereas when we look at the scientific literature, it is very communicative while flagging these kind of things, which are probably very important if one is actually looking at from the perspective of adaptation and mitigation. So as I said, we are trying to expand our horizon in terms of geographical region. At the same time, we are trying to intensify our efforts to get at to or up to the household levels. But one of the very preliminary results which have come from while taking entire Western Himalayas, that the evidences which we have got from, while working in Central Himalayas, typically Uttarakhand state of the country, similar are the patterns when we are talking about Himachal Pradesh and Jammu and Kashmir. Maybe when I get opportunity to share similar kind of things in years to come, we will have entire arc from east to west covered with inherent vulnerability assessments. So I will very quickly go through the learnings which have while carrying out these activities in two contrasting but equally important sectors. One is forest and agriculture, which feed, in fact, forest feeds agriculture ecosystems over there. So these mountain socio-ecological systems are actually much more complex than what we imagine. And there is a huge amount of heterogeneity, which exists over there. When my ecologist friends call it as an Himalayan ecosystem, I actually find it very difficult to digest, because not only from the ecological perspective, but also from the socio-ecological perspective, there is a huge heterogeneity which is over there and which we all need to account for. Incidentally, these socio-ecological systems have remained very dynamic because of the presence of human being over there. But in the near past and somewhere in last 3 to 4 decades, climate change has actually added to such type of complexity. Whether you talk about invasive species, whether you talk about phenology of tree and fruiting plants, or you talk about the agriculture patterns which are overtaking place. So anthropogenic forest fragmentation is actually pronounced, and it is more pronounced in the lower altitudes. What we need to understand and further investigate it, what is making natural fragmentation much more dominant in the higher altitudes? Is it actually giving up the lands which are over there, or the invasive species, or lesser dependence on forest? I don't know, but we need much more in situ data calibration and collection to find an appropriate answer to this. But we very categorically understand today, both from the modeling perspective and mapping perspective, and which were actually carried out in by two different set of scientific groups, that climate change is actually likely to impact the distribution of forest species, and there will be the huge range shift and migration of some of the endemic species which are over there. This is being already communicated when people are working in horticulture orchards. So apple and pear are two of the significant species which are being talked about changing their ecological envelopes. Specifically, when we are talking about mountains, and that to Himalaya, probably more than vulnerability, we need to understand the inherent vulnerability, and we need to test, modify, and further refine the framework which we have developed through this exercise. So probably marginality, fragility, diversity, these are the key attributes of inherent characteristics of mountains, as well as mountain communities, which need to be taken into account whensoever vulnerability is talked. Climate change certainly have multiple effects, as I said, forest ecosystems, but more so, it will have implication on the forest dependent communities. We are talking about a landscape wherein around 80% of their livelihood and energy demands, both for agriculture, livestock, and themselves, is coming from these forest areas. If these forest ecosystems are getting affected, varied, so these forest dependent communities will have different type of challenges which need to be further investigated. Farmer adaptation responses are basically mediated by the resource endowments and the farming practices. So, the institutions, those who have mandate of looking at agriculture and mountain ecosystems, they need to further understand it while carrying out their lab to field experiments, that how things should be taken care of while doing these activities. Community-centric policy is indeed something which is must, which is very much needed, looking at the heterogeneity of these landscapes and the challenges which climate change is actually bringing in. As our research finding across Himalayan mountain belt need to be looked at further detailing of the components so that we don't generalize policies or interventions for mountains. So there is a wide range of climatic variation. Just talking in terms of timberline in the Western Himalayas and the Western Himalayas, they vary in the order of 200 to 300 meters. So that is a significant number. And the final message, which has actually churned out from this research, is that one size fits all. This approach is nowhere helping. Rather, it is bringing much more inequalities when you are talking about farming communities in these mountain ecosystems. So I will rest over here. Basically, the lab which I am hosting here, we play with pixels, but we try to bring people onto these pixels, and we are trying to drift if we can actually hit onto the policy based on our learning, what we get from these pixels and policy. And I get wonderful team members, two of the team members who have actually very intensively contributed through their doctoral research in this kind of understanding. One is Dr. Anushima Chakravarti, and another is with us today, one of the collaborators in COPREPARE, Dr. Rupam Shukla. So such type of research are actually being funded from variety of institutions and organizations. We just try to, make an intact mosaic in terms of inferences while doing these things. Thank you very much.